Jason here, just knocking over my camera as I get set up. Okay. Hi, Matthew, you made it. Thank you so much. I'm not. Am I live yet? I am live. Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Thank you so much for joining me at 8:15 on a Wednesday, or about 8:16, because I knocked over my camera right as I started going. It's a great way to start the week. But welcome to the live stream where we are going to discuss the last 7 founders of the day. Although, to be frank, that's 6 founders and 1 Federalist paper. Federalist 82. Oh, man. Yep. Live on air. That's super embarrassing. Okay. Let's try this again. Okay. Well, I lost my one light. Whoopsie daisy. You know, I just got this new stand. I was real happy about it, and then right as we were starting, I fiddled with it, and now I'm real embarrassed. Welcome to 8:15, as I get it all straightened out, so I look straight for you. And luckily there's only 2 live videos, but a lot of people watch this in hindsight, so I'm not going to edit this video. Oh, well, you get a gift. These kind of things are going to happen when you go live, apparently. Problem is, I don't know where it went. I literally, oh, there it is. I have this light that I had plugged in, and it was pulling back on my camera because I put it right there, and that probably sounded terrible. Oh, man, not a good start to the week. Okay. Let's try this again. Now we're a minute and a half in. Hi, Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day live video, where we will be discussing the last 7 founders of the day. I am about 7 seconds ahead, so I'm now seeing myself fix the camera over out of my peripherals here. The 2 of you here, thank you for coming. Thank you for liking one of you. The other one, please hit like. I would really appreciate it. Some people are starting to roll in. As we're getting started here, as I'm collecting myself, I did want to say, I forgot one of the founders last week, Dr. Thomas Young. And what's interesting is I actually made an article last week about famous Thomases, and I forgot to put him in that too. So I forgot him twice in the last week. Now, to be fair, excuse me one second. In or out? Hey. My cat was trying to push the door open on me. This is not the best week. Okay. Ned, the links you posted below aren't working. Okay, thanks for pointing that out, Ned. I had an issue today where I was getting that same 503 error, and I was setting up this to go out when I had that error. In fact, you might notice that 2 of the founders we're going to talk about don't have links, because the past year and a half, I've always made it founderoftheday.com/first name, last name. Unless, you know, it's a junior or something like that. Sometimes I'll edit that a little bit, but generally it's first name, last name. But some of the articles on the weekend, I had written a long time ago, and I did not know if I had begun using that method by that point. And I say this, I noticed that the 503 error was happening when I was setting these up, and then I looked into it. I use Squarespace because being a webmaster with something like WordPress, while I have a lot more flexibility, it would take a very long time. I'd have to put so much extra time into being a webmaster when Squarespace takes care of these things. So that error happened, and actually, by the time we even started today, and I started knocking things over, and my cat started opening the door, the problem had already corrected itself. And again, that's why I default to a company like Squarespace. Costs a little bit more money than to run it off WordPress, which would be essentially for free, but the quality of the website, I think, is worth it, and the fact that they handle issues like that. So right now it should be good. The links I posted, I had copied one of them and I was typing them in. That might be because I had copied links that had the 503 error at that point. If that is the problem, I apologize. After I do this video, I plan on going back and correcting those links. So, as always, I like to leave the links to the articles we're discussing in the description below. But as we just discussed, They might not be working properly, but I will go back and fix that. I assure you. Thank you so much for pointing that out, though. I do appreciate it. They don't necessarily always come directly to my attention, but as I said, one of the benefits of using a company like Squarespace, or I'm sure like Wix is the same thing, they fix it for me, as opposed to me finding out, and I would have been pulling out my hair for like hours and hours and hours. Like I would have stopped trying to fix that problem to shoot this video and gone back and stayed up all night to fix it, which I was working through WordPress for a while. I've never been a webmaster, but I know a little bit, and I spent so much time just in the first 3 weeks of running Founder of the Day, just fixing problems, that's why I pulled the plug. My 4th week for the website, I took off so I could take everything and get it over to Squarespace and basically start a second time. So thank you for the heads up. Luckily, it's been resolved, and I will fix the issue in the bottom. Anywho, also, before we get started, with this week's Founders, as I mentioned, I forgot to bring up Thomas Young last week. It's just, he eluded me. I don't know why. And I published that article about famous Thomases from the founding last week, and I also forgot about them. So, I forgot him there. So real quick, Thomas Young is a fascinating character. He was from lower upstate New York, right on the border of Connecticut. And at that, he actually became friendly with a young Ethan Allen, and they hung out together and wrote a book about deism that said some bad things about God that a lot of people wouldn't like today, and everyone didn't like back as the revolution was starting. And Young would actually move to Albany, New York briefly, where he participated in what was called the Albany Constitution of 1765. And this is a document I'm still trying to learn about. It wasn't a constitution like a body of government. It was a constitution as in an association, where they were essentially pledging their mutual distaste for the articles of the Stamp Act. And it was there that they founded, to my understanding, and again, I've been kind of looking into this on and off for about a year now, and I don't know a ton about it, but he was there when they wrote the Albany Constitution, which essentially founded the Albany Sons of Liberty. We like to think Sons of Liberty, Boston, and sometimes New York City, but Sons of Liberty broke out all over the place. And he was there for that, but then he left Albany, New York, and went to Boston, where Dr. Thomas Young gave a speech about how tea was bad for you. With people not liking the tea tax, some people started claiming that tea itself was bad for you, kind of like alcohol, lumping it in with alcohol, and Thomas Young was one of these people, and he was giving a speech in Boston that had a large group of people there to watch, and he was talking about how bad tea was for you. Meanwhile, some of his friends were going to Boston Harbor to dump tea off of ships, and he was the one who caused the distraction during the Boston Tea Party. He also allegedly gave Vermont its name based off vert, which is green, and mont, which is mountain in French. So the Green Mountains, and it's the Green Mountain Boys are there. It makes sense. And he would actually end up in Philadelphia and stir the pot, so to speak, in Philadelphia for a while. Let's get on to this week's Founders. Sorry, Dr. Thomas Young, I had missed you. It's not cool. Oh, you read them during the event? Well, Ned, if you go to my website, just go to founderoftheday.com, and the first 5 will be the ones we're talking about this week. You got to go down to the bottom and then work your way up. So count 5 down. That doesn't include the 2 men we'll be discussing that I put over the weekend, because those are older articles. But if you click the search bar, which is, there's a magnifying glass in the top right, if you click on that and just type in the last name, they'll be the first ones that come up. So that's really interesting that you read along. I'm glad I put the links in there. Thank you for validating that decision. That being said, let's start talking about this week. Of course, I'm going to skip over, I did kind of trick you, Ned, because I'm going to skip over the Federalist. Oh, no, I'm having the 503 error has come back. Well, look at that. I guess I'm flying by the seat of my pants this week. Usually I just glance at the headings I put in to help me make sure I'm keeping pace, but anyway, you're right. It wasn't the links. I'm having this issue again. If it proceeds, I will contact Squarespace after this. So last Thursday, I wrote about George Higday, which is a name I had known, and when I saw it when I was doing other research, and I was like, I know that name. How do I know this person? And when I looked into it further, I realized I had known him through the Culper spy ring. And he has a very small part in the Alexander Rose book, Washington Spies, which the TV show Turn is based off of. And actually, the show is written by the same guy, although he does take a lot of liberties when writing that. And this is my book of the week, so I have a affiliate link in the description if you want to pick up a copy. If you haven't read it, it's one of probably my top 5 books of the American Revolution. I mean, it's spies. It's fun. And Higday doesn't have a big part in it. He's about a page and a half, but his story is fascinating. So Higday was just kind of a farmer who lived just north of New York City. And he didn't really take sides in the war. He had patriot leanings, but he was one of the many, many, many people who just stayed out of it. Most people just stayed out of the Revolutionary War. Or I guess I shouldn't say most. About a third. About a third of the citizens were patriots, a third were loyalists, and a third were indifferent. And Higday seemed to be indifferent, but he helped. There were some soldiers escaping British prison ships in New York City, and he helped them cross the water. Now, word of this got back to George Washington, who was only just really starting his now famous Culper spy ring with Benjamin Talmadge. And Benjamin Talmadge was in Connecticut, and Washington wrote to Talmadge and said, hey, there's this guy, George Higday, who's in Manhattan, who I think we can use. He helped us liberate some patriots, but the British trust him, and he's kind of a nitwit, or I don't know how to say it politely. He's not the brightest bushel in the barrel, which is not a saying. But Higday might be able to help. So Washington sends this letter to Talmadge, who's stationed in Connecticut. Additionally, he sends money to give to Abraham Woodhull, who was leading the spy ring from Long Island. Now, it just so happens that the British suspected Talmadge of being the leader of the spy ring. And Bannister Tarleton, who would later be more famous for his ferocity in the southern department of the war, Tarleton, who was a British officer, led a small contingent to attack Talmadge. Now, after a brief skirmish, Talmadge got away, most of the Americans got away, but Tarleton captured Talmadge's horse. And on his horse was not just this money to pay Woodhull, but a letter from General George Washington that said, hey, you might be able to use this guy Higday. Now, first of all, this confirmed the British's theory that Talmadge was, in fact, the head of the spy ring. And that's why they targeted him specifically. There was no really other reason to be attacking this group stationed in Connecticut, kind of far from anything. But they correctly assessed that he was the man to get. And while they didn't get him, now they were certain. And they were certain there was now a spy ring in New York City. So all their fears were confirmed, so to speak. Also, it says the name Higday in the letter. Now, Washington would later write to Talmadge very upset that, hey, you can't be letting the British take the money for our spy ring and take these letters. And he actually wrote, again, about Higday saying, hey, no one's going to suffer worse than this guy. And Washington, the thing is, Washington's the one who used Higday's real name. So it's kind of on him, although no one's ever going to say that to George Washington, and nor would he probably admit that, although he definitely realized it. As for Higday, he had no idea any of this was going on. He thought he helped these guys cross the water. I did my part. I'm going back home to my farm. Suddenly, the British start knocking on the door, saying, hey, guess what? We know your secret. And Higday seems to have been what secret? And they brought him into the city, and they interrogated him. Now, we don't know how vicious the interrogation was, if it was vicious at all. But we do know that Higday wrote a letter of confession. Again, might have been under duress, maybe not. He essentially says he went to George Washington and met with Washington, which, no. and he also says that Washington offered him some money, but not enough. So he decided not to work with the Patriots because they didn't offer him enough money. Now, Higday disappears from the record from here. According to Alexander Rose, in this great book, linked below, I highly recommend it, according to Rose, it doesn't seem likely that the British General Howe would have punished him. He probably was not hung as a spy. He should have been hung because he kind of was a spy, but probably not because he never really became a spy. He just helped out that once. And the British like to use their found espionage agents. They like to spare their lives if they would work as double agents. Now again, Higday never shows up, especially because Higday would be super suspect. If the British let him go when he came to George Washington and was like, hey, you want to tell me secrets? Then Washington would have known, no, he's obviously working as a double agent. And Higday disappears into the shadows of history. But, very interestingly, this is the impetus for them to develop the codex that they use, the secret code that the culprit spy ring would use from there on out to make sure their communications were kept secret, and if they were intercepted, would not be exposing their own information. So George Higday, kind of a nobody, kind of found himself in the middle of something he was not ready for, but still ended up being a major, major inspiration for the development of the culprit spy ring, which ended up being essential to winning the war in several ways. So again, Washington Spies. It's a terrific, terrific book. Moving on to last weekend. These I did have pulled up. So, on Tuesday, I wrote about, on Saturday, we discussed Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut. Oliver Ellsworth, and before I move on, I want to see, did anyone comment or anything? Nope. Okay, just checking. Oliver Ellsworth is probably, arguably, in my opinion, the most important founder who didn't sign any documents. So, I will explain. Oliver Ellsworth was from a middling family in Connecticut, but by the time the Revolutionary War broke out, he had worked his way up to state attorney, which essentially was Attorney General for Connecticut, is the best thing we can compare it to today. So he works as he's in this position, and he becomes an ardent patriot, and he's very outspoken. Now, he ends up being elected and sent to the Continental Congress, and this is really one of the first offices he holds, but it's in 1777, so independence had already been declared, and he was sent because he had been an active patriot the whole time. He goes to the Continental Congress, declaration's already signed. He's there through the remainder of the war. Now, I'm not sure why he didn't sign the Articles of Confederation. They may have already been signed by the time he got there. Connecticut was probably one of the ones that signed early. Although, as many people did, they traveled back and forth to home. He might have just missed Connecticut's opportunity to sign. Either way, he doesn't sign it. He serves the remainder of the war. Goes back home, becomes a leading politician in Connecticut, is appointed to Connecticut's first Supreme Court under its first constitution, what we would consider its Supreme Court. So he makes himself known as not only a lawman in his state, a justice in his state, but has experience on the national stage. And then the Constitutional Convention is called to order. And Oliver Ellsworth is sent to the Constitutional Convention. He's there for most of the summer. While he's there, Roger Sherman gets most of the credit, and I'm a part of the problem, because I'm one of many people who give Roger Sherman most of the credit for the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise. But it was the Connecticut Compromise because it was people from Connecticut, not just Roger Sherman, but Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut. And if you're unaware, the Connecticut Compromise was the argument going on in the Constitutional Convention was the big states wanted the House of Representatives and the Senate to be chosen based on population, and the small states wanted the House of Representatives and the Senate to be chosen equally. The Great Compromise, aka Connecticut Compromise, which Oliver Ellsworth is one of the people who helped hash out, came to the agreement that the House of Representatives would be based on population, and the Senate would be divided equally, 2 for each state. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's how the United States government currently works. And it was the biggest standoff, and it seems like such a reasonable answer to us today in hindsight. But at the time, it took a lot of thinking to arrange this unique government. And it still stands 200 plus, 230 years later, thanks to to no small part, Oliver Ellsworth. So Ellsworth goes back to Connecticut, and I don't want to skip this. He leaves the Constitutional Convention 3 weeks before it was signed, and does not sign the United States Constitution. He also participated on the first Committee of Style, which was the first draft of the United States Constitution. He was one of the people who helped write. But he returned early and did not sign the U.S. Constitution. What a dummy. I know, but he didn't. So, although he is a framer of the United States government, he is not a signer of any of the documents. But his story is far from over. He goes back to Connecticut and he fights to ratify the U.S. Constitution, which Connecticut is one of the first to do. Within the first 4 months of when the Constitution was signed, the Connecticut ratifies. And again, Oliver Ellsworth is a leader in that. And because of this, when the government meets for the first time, he is chosen as one of the first 6 senators to go to the United States Senate. I'm sorry, first 6 senators. First, he's an inaugural senator at a time when there were only 13 states, which meant there were only 26 people in the history of the world who can say they were an inaugural member of the United States Congress. Oliver Ellsworth is one of these people. And he goes. And while he's there, he's extraordinarily important. Mostly because he helps organize the Judiciary Act. And the Judiciary Act was the one that created the Justice Department of the United States. The Constitution is very vague on the Justice Department and how it's supposed to work. But it basically says it's up to the Senate and the House of Representatives to create the Justice Department. And Ellsworth goes in and does not only most of the writing of the act, but most of the groundwork, the House floor jibber jabber, I don't know what you would call it, the dirty work of getting people to vote for it. And then it passes the Senate and goes down to the House of Representatives where it passes. And the Justice Department that we have today, and by Justice Department, I mean federal judges throughout the nation. Now, things have changed as the nation's grown and just time has elapsed, things have changed. But the body of what Ellsworth created is still there. He said that passes the Senate, goes down to the House of Representatives, where James Madison, who Ellsworth's now known for 10 years or so, from their time in the Continental Congress, their time in the Constitutional Convention, and James Madison motions to have it voted on in the House of Representatives, and it's voted on and passes. And then James Madison gets the House to pass the Bill of Rights. And he has his old friend, Oliver Ellsworth, be the one to introduce the Bill of Rights on the floor of the United States Senate, where it is voted on and passed. But Ellsworth's not done yet. No, as I said, he's one of the most important founders who didn't sign anything and no one knows about. So, some time goes by, and Ellsworth, and I'm going to skip down here, make sure I'm not skipping anything. Nope. Ellsworth is chosen, nominated, and then approved by, he's nominated by George Washington to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. So John Jay had retired, and John Rutledge, another much underappreciated founder who did a lot for the United States, he was already on the Supreme Court, and he is chosen as an interim Chief Justice until he can be approved. Unfortunately, not to get too off topic, but Rutledge said some bad things about John Jay and some bad things about George Washington because of the Jay Treaty, and therefore was not approved to be Chief Justice. So although Rutledge was the second Chief Justice in the United States history, he is considered the second acting Chief Justice of the United States, he was not approved. And Oliver Ellsworth is the second approved Chief Justice of the or I should say confirmed Chief Justice of the United States. And technically he's the third, but Rutledge was only there for a few months and then actually tried to kill himself. And that's I think I made a video a while about that. I should make another one soon. Rutledge is an amazing story. I highly recommend you look into John Rutledge. Anyway, so what do you know? Oliver Ellsworth is now Chief Justice of the United States. He's there about 5 years. Nothing much happens in the Supreme Court at this point. It would still be a few years before Marbury versus Madison really cemented the idea of judicial review, that the Supreme Court got to review laws and determine their constitutionality. But he did oversee a few cases. The major change, to my understanding, that Ellsworth made when it comes to the Supreme Court was when he first stepped in, what they would do is each justice on the court would write their own decision and publish them. But Ellsworth made the change where the court made one decision, and one decision was published unanimously. I shouldn't say unanimously because the votes weren't unanimous, but as one body. Now, over the years, it did end up that there would be a dissenting opinion published also, but again, the decision is one decision, as opposed to each one publishing their own decision and the majority of decisions won the day. Now it was, here's our one decision with our and a dissenting opinion. We're not done with Oliver Ellsworth. No. Ellsworth was then, while sitting Chief Justice, appointed envoy extraordinary with two other people, and he traveled to France because the quasi-war with France had broken out, and he went there to negotiate the end of the quasi-war with France. And he did, and it became known as the Convention of 1800, after which the Treaty of Alliance was ratified, which basically said, okay, we're not going to attack your ships at sea, you can trade with Britain. Because France would be like, oh, you're trading with Britain, we're going to attack your ship. And now it's like, no, you can trade with whoever you want, we're friends now. And it's interesting because just a year or 2 years later is, now that we're friends again with France, we make the Louisiana Purchase. And that would not have happened had we not ended the Quasi-War and set up this Treaty of Alliance. Thank you, Oliver Ellsworth. Very underappreciated founder. He would retire not long after that to Connecticut, where he would retire and be a counselor to the governor of Connecticut in his retirement. And he, of course, would be replaced with the fourth Chief Justice, John Marshall, who sat there forever and basically took the justice system that Ellsworth essentially had. Ellsworth brought the clay to the table and molded it to look like a justice system, and John Marshall would take that and make it into a perfected sculpture, so to speak. So that is Oliver Ellsworth. I know, how much time? Yeah, I spent about 20 minutes on Oliver Ellsworth. I can't help it. He has so much. There's actually 2 articles on my website about Ellsworth's life, because you can't fit all that into one. It just wouldn't be fair to try and squeeze it into one. He's one of those guys who just did so much. So much. We're going to move on to Payne Wingate. I'm going to take a quick sip of my coffee. I realized if we're going to be doing these at night, I need to be drinking coffee while I do it. A little pick-me-up. I don't drink a lot of coffee during the day. You might have noticed my cup. You will permit me to put on my spectacles. That's Mr. George Washington. So if you like that quote, it's probably my favorite George Washington quote. It seems super random, but it's nice for nerds like us who wear glasses and whatnot. And it just seems like a silly quote from George Washington, but he actually gave it during his Nuremberg speech, which prevented dictatorship from taking over the young United States. If you check out the link below on my shop, I have those on my shop, and there is a video I made and an article that are all linked there. Feel free to check it out. You help me pay for my Squarespace if you make a purchase or two. Let's move on to Payne Wingate. Very unknown name. A New Hampshire resident. Didn't do a whole lot during the Revolutionary War. Oh, you got my mug now. Oh, thank you. I hope you like it. I got the big one. There's regular size ones too. I really appreciate that. It does. Every penny I bring in at this point is just helping me pay down the website, you know? So thank you so much for your support. And thank you for coming to this video and hitting like, because hitting like is the best thing you can do to help. That's not really a joke. It's funny, but it's not a joke. It's actually true. Anyhoozle, Payne Wingate, New Hampshire, doesn't do much in the Revolutionary War, but he is making his way up in local politics. He supports. He does end up getting. I love coffee. I love coffee too, Ned. But I've grown old and now. My heart doesn't like it so much, so I have to be very careful. I only have it once or twice a week. It'll be my special treat to myself when I do these live videos. Anyway, Payne Wingate from New Hampshire ends up rising through the ranks and gets sent to the Continental Congress, or I should say the Confederation Congress, right after the Constitution is signed, and he is sent to the Continental Congress to help implement the new Constitution and destroy the old Articles of Confederation, essentially. So he does this, and then he's appointed as a senator, and he is, like Oliver Ellsworth, one of the inaugural senators of the United States of America. So, I do see a question coming in. I will answer that in a second. I'm just going to get through Payne Wingate. So he's an inaugural senator of the United States, again, one of only 26 people, and he helps Oliver Ellsworth with the Judiciary Act. Now, as I said before, it seemed like I was implying that Oliver Ellsworth did this all by himself. No, he did do most of the work, but it was a committee that made this project. And Payne Wingate was on that committee that created the Judiciary Act and the judicial system of the United States. And then they voted on the Judiciary Act, and Payne Wingate, who helped create it, voted against it because Payne Wingate didn't like it. Now, many anti-federalists didn't like the Judiciary Act because they thought it was too powerful. They thought it would just destroy the United States government. Payne Wingate thought it was too weak. He wanted the federal government to have a much stronger judicial system. Furthermore, he also, while he was a senator, they got rid of the secrecy rule. And much due to Albert Gallatin, which is, again, a much longer side note. But at first, the United States Senate met in secret. And then they didn't, because it was supposed to be a republic, and they wanted to be open and transparent. And Payne Wingate didn't like that. He thought it was better for the body if they could meet in secret, because if you said something on the floor that you would later regret, well, only the people in the room would know about it, as opposed to the papers publishing. So, pretty much, that was Payne Wingate's time in the Senate. Now, this is very interesting. He leaves the United States Senate because he's elected to the United States House of Representatives. Back when the government was created, senators were appointed. We didn't elect senators until the 1900s. So he was appointed as a senator, and then the people voted for him to be in the House of Representatives. And since the House was the one people could vote for, it was supposed to be the one that represented the people. And many, including Payne Wingate, actually preferred to be in the House of Representatives because they were representing the people. He ends up going back, and he, after his one term in the House, he goes back to New Hampshire. Doesn't do a whole lot. He does work on the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And interestingly, when Payne Wingate passed away in 1838, he was the last surviving inaugural member of those 26 of the first United States Senate. So that is Payne Wingate. I think he's very interesting. I did see a comment coming in. Israel, I wonder if Edward Rutledge, signer of the Declaration of John Rutledge, yes, Edward Rutledge, signer of the Declaration, is brothers of John Rutledge. Brothers. I'm like 99% sure. I always say it with confidence, but now that I'm saying it in front of a live camera that I knocked over, I am now second-guessing myself. But no, I am, and look it up and let me know if I'm wrong, but I am 99.999% sure they're brothers. John Rutledge was very young when he went to the Stamp Act Congress, and then was still fairly young when he went to the first Continental Congress. And then Edward went to Continental Congress, and John went and became, I think, the first governor. One of the early governors. I'm pretty sure the first governor of South Carolina. I found it. So yes, they are 100% related. And Edward, I always get the Pinckneys and Rutledges a little bit twisted in my head. But if I'm not mistaken, Edward yeah, Edward Rutledge was the first attorney, would go on to be the first attorney general, while his brother would go on to be a suicidal Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Rutledges were very, very important. And of course, yep, site's gone down. I apologize that my website seems to be having a lot of problems right now. It's real tough. I tested it out to see if I can go into these, so I'll just have to go by memory. Anyway, on Monday I published an article about Luther Baldwin. Again, Luther Baldwin is a guy nobody knows about. I think, did I miss some comments before going to the next guy? There's no link for Payne Wingate. Yeah, I apologize. You spelled Wingate right. You spelled Payne right. It usually works. I'm sure it will be back in order within the next few hours. It goes in and out. The internet stuff. Anyway, so Luther Baldwin. Oh, okay, your website's working fine. Interesting. Anyway, Luther Baldwin was hanging out in a tavern in New Jersey, throwing back some drinks. Meanwhile, President John Adams is making his way from Philadelphia to Massachusetts because he's taking a vacation with his wife. Now, the quasi-war with France is going on, and they had just passed this little thing called the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act was saying if you said bad things about the president, you got thrown in jail. In hindsight, history has looked on the Sedition Act very poorly. Sorry, Mr. Adams, not the best move. Now, the Sedition Act was mostly used to imprison congressmen like Matthew Lyon, or mostly publishers, people who published articles that were critical of the president. There was a man named Luther Baldwin, who, as I said, was throwing back some drinks in Jersey, and the president comes through, and there's a big party and a parade, and they shoot off cannons, and one of Baldwin's friends says, they're shooting it at the president, like, joking. And Baldwin says, I hope they shoot him in the arse. Pardon my language, but again, it's the first time I've used a bad word in the title of one of my articles, because I hope they shoot him through his arse. And seems to have been a joke, but the owner of the tavern overheard this, and so did some Federalists, and they made a big stink about it, and they said, that's sedition, you're talking bad about the president. And he was actually prisoned. He was tried, sentenced to pay the court fees, pay a fine, I think it was like $250, but like, translating to today, a couple of $1,000, and put in prison for 2 months. Now, he became fairly famous throughout the country because the Democratic Republican papers got their hands on this and said, hey, they're just throwing anyone in jail. And people got real upset. It was one thing if you were throwing reporters in jail, but it's another thing to just go throw anyone in jail. Some random guy in Jersey because he's drinking beers and making jokes that are perhaps in poor taste, but still, you can't just go throw anyone in jail. He was a Continental Army veteran. He was clearly a patriot. He's not the problem here. Now, as for Baldwin, he kind of vanishes into history after this, as many of the people we seem to be talking about this week do. He just vanishes into the footnotes of history. There's not a lot known about his later life, but his small little part in the founding of the United States was to wish that they were shooting a cannon through President John Adams' arse. Anyway, moving on. I did see some comments coming through. Our website is working. Okay, thank you. I am still having a little trouble with the website over here as I live stream. Is that a picture of Baldwin that accompanied your article, or is it some random drunk guy? It is a random drunk guy from the Revolution. You got me. When I'm picking out images, I only put one image on every article. I've actually been trying to work out recently how to make them the right size when I put them on Facebook. For whatever reason, the thumbnails sometimes come out super small. Not all of the founders I have have been documented. Especially some of the lower level people, like many of the people we're talking about this week, never had their image drawn. Even some of the more wealthy, well-to-do people never had their image drawn. So I have to cover somehow, and you got me. It was a random drunk dude that I found on the internet. I typed in something like 18th century drunk guy with that in. You know, I have to be very careful with the images I use. I can't, if I use someone else's image, then I can get sued and they can try and come at me for the no money I make next to nothing on Founder of the Day. So they're not getting much. But fortunately, talking about the 18th century, much of the people who do have images are public domain at this point because they were drawn 200 plus years ago. So when I type in 18th century drunk guy, I use that picture. And I do believe it was part of a greater image. Again, not working right now for whatever reason, but I do believe it was part of a greater image that I zoomed in on the drunk guy to not trick you, Ned. Let's see, he looked like he was having a good time. Well, that's what happens when you're drinking in a tavern on the cusp of the birth of the United States. Anyway, moving on. I'm getting a little behind here, so let's speed it up a little bit. I believe the next person was Elizabeth Burgin. I actually wrote about Elizabeth Burgin months ago when I wrote about Van Buren. I think it was Abraham Van Buren, who was like a great uncle of future President Martin Van Buren. And I wrote about his relationship with Elizabeth Burgin, not even making the connection that I had never written about Burgin, and I knew who she was, because it was some girl who helped him escape from a prison ship. But no, Elizabeth Burgin we don't know a lot about her again. I wrote about a lot of people we don't know a lot about, but her story relates to Higday, who was captured that we spoke about earlier. So Burgin was living in New York City, and it seems like her husband died in the Revolutionary War fighting for the Continental Army, although that can't be verified. We do know she was widowed and had 3 children, and she decided to start helping people on prison ships. She actually brought food and supplies to people on prison ships, helping out hundreds of people in really the worst conditions. Then she started helping people escape from prison. And she helped 3 officers escape from the prison ships, and while she was doing so, she's the one who brought them to the aforementioned George Higday, and together they helped get them across the water. Now, when Higday wrote his confession that I spoke about earlier, he told them he was working with Elizabeth Burgin. Now, Burgin, again, was just a woman kind of doing it out of the goodness of her heart. She was obviously a patriot and did help a lot. But as soon as she found out she had been outed, she hid in New York City for a few weeks, and then she moved undercover, and there are different stories of where she went exactly, but it sounds like she went out to Long Island and then up through Connecticut, down through Jersey, to Philadelphia, where she begged for the assistance of certain high-ranking revolutionaries, including George Washington, who was aware of her hard work. And George Washington right away started giving her rations as if she was a soldier, because now she was destitute. Because her entire life was now gone because she couldn't go back to New York City, where the British had occupied, and she had been helping free their prisoners. So she does get the assistance of George Washington. And then Washington on Christmas Day writes, 79, I think it was, maybe 1780. I don't remember the exact year, but I remember very specifically, it was Christmas Day, wrote to the Continental Congress. And the Continental Congress put her case in the hands of the Board of War. And the Board of War decided to grant her a pension as if she was part of the military. And she received money from the Continental Congress at least through 1787. It's the last time we hear of her, and then again, like seemingly everyone I'm talking about this week, she disappears from the historical record. But Elizabeth Burgin was a savior to many, many downtrodden American soldiers who were imprisoned, and she was a hero, although very not well known. But now you know. That's what we're here for. And lastly, today I published an article about James Moore. And James Moore was one of the upper class people that didn't have a picture. I had to find something for him. But Moore was from North Carolina, and he was one of the first people appointed to a position. He actually his brother-in-law was running to get the command of the North Carolina the first North Carolina line in the Continental Army. But he ended up getting it, and Moore did what most people were doing. This is the first year of the war. In 1776, he runs essentially the military in North Carolina. During this time, the siege of Boston is going on. There's not a lot going on down in North Carolina, although the British did land their navy in Wilmington, which Moore was supposed to defend, but then they left again and went south. And it was during this time that he organized the Battle of Moore's Creek Bridge. Now, his name is James Moore. Excuse me 1 second. I'm sorry, an hour is a long time to talk. His name was James Moore, and he helped win the Battle of Moore's Creek Bridge. I was unable to find anything connecting his last name Moore to Moore's Creek Bridge spelled the same way. I'm just putting that out there. I thought about writing about that in my article, but I didn't want it to get too cumbersome. I was just hoping people would assume one way or another, because I realized I was using the name Moore very often in this article. And twice in one sentence, I was forced to do it sometimes. And I try when I'm writing not to use the same word too many times in the same sentence or even in the same paragraph. But I had to be like James Moore and Moore's Creek Bridge. Anyway, don't worry about my problems. So James Moore was, he didn't fight in Moore's Creek Bridge, but he had two, not generals, other commanders, other officers below him. I believe they were both colonels, but I'm not entirely sure. But it was Richard Caswell and Alexander Lillington. And I realized I'd never written an article on Richard Caswell, so expect that in the very near future. Because I thought I had. I've mentioned him several times. I think he was a signer of the Articles of Confederation. But anyway, he puts them at Moore's Creek Bridge. Now, he's not there for it, but this is in 1776, early 1776. Like, they're still sieging Boston. Washington and the whole fledgling Continental Army are still in Boston, and they're in North Carolina. And a band of British troops, mostly loyalists, are moving, and they're met by Lillington and Caswell at Moore's Creek Bridge, and they're surprised, and they are absolutely, I don't want to say slaughtered, but the Patriots have an astounding victory. They take about 850 men prisoner and only have one casualty. They took 850 prisoners and have one casualty. And there is not a lot going on in the South at this point in the war. But because he organized this, the Continental Congress quickly makes James Moore a brigadier general in the Continental Army, one of only a handful of North Carolinians who become brigadier general. Now, things get a little unfortunate from here, because he spends the next year doing what generals do when there's not a lot of active fighting, and that is he's trying to raise money and get supplies for his army. He does it very successfully, actually. He, of course, runs into trouble, but he, doing this, not physical trouble, just tough times getting it done, but he does it very, very well. And then the following year, in early 1777, at just 40 years old, he just suddenly passes away. They called it, the quote that I read called it, gout of the stomach. Now, I'm not entirely sure what gout of the stomach is referencing back then. I don't think it's a thing now. I don't know if it's a real thing. I was in the impression it was something like a burst appendix or something like that. But he had something wrong with his stomach, and he died at 40 years old. So, tissues and teardrops. It's really sad. Because what I read, you see a lot of people at the time quoting, and even a lot of historians afterwards, basically James Moore was supposed to be very important in the Continental Army. In fact, I can't believe I forgot I left this out. During the year that he's raising all this money, Charles Lee was commander of the Southern Department, but Lee gets recalled to the north to help fortify New York City before the British arrive. And although he's never officially given the position, he spends about 4 to 6 months, James Moore, as commander of the Southern Department. And that's the position he held when he died. He was in charge of North Carolina through Georgia, was his command. And after he died, I mean, Robert Howe would come on board and take that position, and then Horatio Gates would take the position, and a lot of people had a very bad time running the Southern Department until, of course, Nathaniel Greene came down and became the second, in my opinion, second most important general of the Revolutionary War after George Washington, because he ended the war in the South for all intents and purposes. But this would have probably all fallen onto James Moore had he not suddenly passed away. And because not only was he so good at raising the funds that needed to supply his army, but because strategically he was so good at the Battle of Moore's Creek Bridge. And I should note that even before the war started, he had fought in several militia wars in North Carolina. There's the War of the Regulators, which is, again, a big discussion that I should make a video about, which leading up to the American Revolution, it was essentially, there was a revolt in western, what we would now consider central North Carolina, but then western North Carolina, that was suppressed by the wealthy elites on the coast that they were rebelling against, of which James Moore was one of those elites. Many of the future founders from North Carolina were of the elites, although many of the regulators ended up fighting in the Continental Army. So I don't want to badmouth them by any sense of the word. So that's the story of James Moore. No, it came back up. That's the story of James. Now that I'm done, he could have been an American hero, and that's what I titled the article. He could have been an American hero, and he probably would have been an American hero, but sometimes things don't go great. So before we move on, I'm going to take a look. Oh, we're already at 50 minutes. Ooh, we're running long. We're running long. Let's get it done. It's 9 o'clock. Is it a picture? Is that a John Adams book on my shelf? Curious for a time now. Okay, I'll tell you what, Israel, let me get through this week's Federalist, and then I'll answer that. I don't think I have a John Adams book up there, but I do think there's a picture you're looking at of John Adams. These are not all my books. These are just some of my favorites I decided to put in the background in case people ask, and I will be happy to discuss that, but I know some people, it's getting a little bit late, and some people are going to want to get to bed. So, real quick, let's talk about Federalist number 82. Again, it's Alexander Hamilton. He is finishing up his discussion on the Supreme Court. And essentially he's talking about the idea of concurrent jurisdiction. So a lot of the anti-federalists were saying, hey, why do we have a federal judiciary when we have state governments? You're just going to destroy the state governments. And the idea, and Hamilton talks about concurrent jurisdiction, and it's a legal mumbo-jumbo term. I'm not going to get too into it, but essentially it means that both the federal government and the state government have authority to resolve cases in the same place. And the way we look at it today is if you live in, say, Virginia, and you want to sue someone in Texas, you can either sue them in a Texas state court, or you can sue them in a federal court. Now, this isn't it. Of course, there was no Texas at the time. This is just a modern example to help illustrate what concurrent jurisdiction is. Now, Hamilton was saying, we have concurrent jurisdiction, and he capitalized the part, one whole. We are parts of one whole. The state courts are very important, as are the federal courts. They mix and mingle, and they're all part of the same thing. Now, personally, I found it interesting that he was saying this to people who said, you're just going to destroy, anti-federalists saying, you're going to destroy the state courts, they're going to be pointless. And Hamilton said, no, they're going to become part of the whole and part of the federal government. But essentially he was saying, well, yeah, they're going to become part of the federal government. They'll be run at the state level, and he argued, kind of, that, hey, you're still going to have your state courts and your local courts, and they're still going to make decisions, but, if someone appeals, then it goes above your head to the federal government. It's a very interesting workaround. He was using a lot of words to say, yeah, but that's the best way to do it. To be fair to Hamilton, he was saying, yes, but we are going to make the states courts just a part of the federal courts, but that's the best way to go about it. But he takes a very long way around to say that. He's a little sneaky about it. Hamilton could be a little sneaky. Everyone could be sneaky. I know many founders who were very sneaky. Yeah, so that's essentially Federalist number 82 boiled down. Again, I like to boil the Federalist down as much as I can. And that's pretty much it for the founders. if you had any questions, again, lay them down. Israel, I am going to look behind me, which is not how you're supposed to talk on camera, but you're also not supposed to knock the camera over when you start a live video, so I'm doing things a little different this week. I was thinking about doing a video where I just kind of go through these books. I had done something similar right when I started this channel, back when it still looked like garbage, and I was talking really quiet, like a historian, so you can't hear me. I was talking very quiet and deliberately, trying to be cool about it, but that's not who I am. I talk a lot, and I'm loud. Are you looking at, I don't know if you can hear me if I turn my head like that. Are you looking at that? Is that it? I don't know. The pictures here, I'll point out the pictures. Little Thomas Paine down there. We have a tiny little John Stark up there. Founding martyr, Joseph Warren. Great book. I recommended that, I think, last week. This one's John Jay. That one is Jefferson's treasurer is Albert Gallatin, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. Secretary of the Treasury for the entire Thomas Jefferson administration. William Cooper, last founder. If you know of Cooperstown, New York, where the Baseball Hall of Fame is, William Cooper is technically a founder and has a big biography. I went to college in Oneonta, New York, about 20 minutes from Cooperstown, so I'm really interested in Cooper in particular, and this book was on sale everywhere in that part of the world. It's a good book. It's full of information. I actually haven't read through it in probably 10 years, now that I'm saying it, but it's a little... it's not the easiest, smoothest read. Instead, they go for filling it up with information, so it's very good. It's just... if you're looking for a quick breeze, that's not it. But a really interesting founder, one of those small founders who usually doesn't have their own biography, has a great biography. I need to do a William Cooper. I have not done him yet. Oh, that's so strange. This one's William Cooper. That one is about John Quincy Adams, written by a man named William Cooper. So I actually... I'm sorry, I pointed at John Quincy Adams and called him William Cooper because the guy who wrote the book also has the same name, William Cooper. We got a Jefferson and an Aaron Burr. We got a big Burr on the back there. If you guys have any other questions, let me know. Now's the time. I know we're running a little bit. Oh, just about an hour. Not too much. The one I pointed to was the one I thought was Adams. But I'll assume it's the one you can see. Yeah, you know what? Maybe I'll do a video later this week. I've been trying to keep my regular everyday videos as short as I can, like under 4 minutes, because I notice more people will watch those. Because here's the information. Here's the information. I don't have to give you every detail about their life. Here's what you need to know about this person no one remembers. It seemed to work out better than what I was doing for a while, was making them about 10 minutes long, and I could see why people fell off of them. It's not that I ramble, I'm just trying to give too much when you just want a little bit of information, as opposed to these live streams, which I'm really happy the amount of people who have been turning out. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys watching, because, especially now that we moved it to Wednesdays, we're getting a lot of people watching, and it's fun, and you're watching for an hour, which is super sweet. Thank you so much. I'm going to check for one more. Again, if you have a question, now's the time. I'm getting a little hot here. Summertime, I didn't consider how hot it would get during the summertime while I was making these, when I have to close my windows to keep the sound out and turn my fans off. Alright, unless there's another question, thank you guys so much for watching. Again, I apologize for knocking the camera over when we got started. You guys have any founders you want me to write about or talk about? Leave them in the comments. Any questions or concerns? I am ears wide open. If you want to support the channel, again, I have a link to my Patreon down below. Every little bit helps. Or you can do what Ned did and buy one of these coffee mugs or one of my t-shirts. I have quotes that I really like. And if you go to the shop, each shirt or coffee mug has an article and a video explaining the quote that I chose and why I like them so much. So check them out. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I will be back with another regular founder of the day tomorrow.